and in 5 years' time, this will happen and everybody will be using this.
Hey everyone, welcome to the AI Canvas, the podcast that explores the impact of generative AI on businesses, the arts, and our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Foster, co-founder of Applied Data Science Partners and author of the book Generative Deep Learning, Teaching Machines to Paint, Write, Compose, and Play. Now, over the coming weeks, we'll be diving deep into fascinating conversations with a diverse range of thought leaders, including musicians, artists, journalists, educators, marketers, lawyers, and those at the cutting edge of this fascinating field. We'll explore their unique insights into the opportunities and potential threats of deploying this technology across industries and how it's going to reshape our world. We have a fascinating conversation ahead of us, so sit back, relax, and let's dive into the world of generative AI right here on the AI Canvas. Hey everyone, welcome back to the AI Canvas, the podcast where we explore the impact of generative AI on business, the arts, and our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Foster, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Chris Stokel-Walker. Now, Chris is a freelance journalist. He specializes in technology and digital culture, and is the author of 2 books, including YouTubers, How YouTube Shook Up TV and Created a New Generation of Stars, and TikTok Boom, China's Dynamite app and the superpower race for social media. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Wired, New Scientist, The Guardian, The Times, you name it. And he also teaches journalism at Newcastle University. So I can't think of a better person who's going to explore with us the impact of AI, and particularly generative AI, on journalism and everything to do with society. So Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Great. So perhaps let's just start off with a bit about you. Perhaps could you just give us a brief summary of your career to date, how you got into digital and technology journalism, and in general, your thoughts on generative AI? I'm really excited about it.
Yeah. So I've been doing journalism for around about a decade now. I also studied at Newcastle University as well as teaching there. I did an English literature degree, did a BA. Take great joy in telling my journalism students that they are by default more qualified than I am at the job of journalism as soon as they step into the classroom. Graduated from there, did an office job for a couple of years. My boss then said that I wrote like I should write for The Economist, so I took that as a literal challenge and started pitching The Economist ideas for stories. And had always been interested in tech, had always kind of been interested in the intersection between technology and society and the kind of both the friction and the sparks that occur when those two things collide. And so got started in the world of journalism, have then been doing it ever since, running on this weird treadmill, hamster wheel that is the constantly innovating world of technology, and didn't have as many bags under my eyes when I started out. I was having a conversation with a fellow journalist, a relatively senior tech editor at a large media outlet a couple of weeks ago, and we were just talking about how we've been exhausted over the last year with pretty much everything from Elon Musk to the generative AI revolution, which has kind of dominated our lives over the last 6 months. And it is, as you said, kind of what are your thoughts on this generally? Kind of wish that it wasn't happening, because it means that I would possibly get a little bit more sleep and a little bit more time with my girlfriend and family. But ultimately, this is a hugely exciting time because we have always seen tech journalism and its impact on society happening constantly, which is partly why I was so keen on kind of the tech and digital culture space, is because I think often tech is kind of maligned in journalism as this separate thing, whereas actually it's integral to everything that we do. But that is kind of being demonstrated enormously in the rise of generative AI and kind of what we've seen over the last 6 months with ChatGPT and everything else, where no matter what you're talking about, it will impact on your life if it hasn't already. And that means we have to have huge, interesting conversations about it, and also that we need to kind of hold all of these companies to account in a way that journalism can do best.
Yeah, for sure. And I totally feel you when you say it's exhausting keeping up with the pace of change. I'd be interested to dig more into that, have you really felt in your time as a journalist that this is the most manic we've ever been from a technological perspective as a society, in that it feels like the technological change is suddenly too fast for everybody to actually keep up with, but both from a consumer point of view, people using these tools and having to keep pace with what the likes of OpenAI are doing, but also, from a journalistic perspective, that the reporting of yesterday may be suddenly out of date within 2 weeks, and it feels extraordinarily stressful, not just from someone in the space that we, such as us, where we're helping companies to build these tools, but also from someone like yourself who's trying to report and keep pace with it. Do you think it's the most manic we've ever been as a society technologically?
I mean, it's certainly the most manic that's been in the 10 years that I've been doing this. And I think I'd have to kind of defer to slightly older, slightly wiser heads on whether or not that's the case. But I mean, I've you mentioned book one and book two on YouTube and TikTok. I have a third book that's coming out in October, which is called The History of the Internet in Bite-Sized Chunks, which has allowed me to look at kind of, previous eras of tech revolution, I suppose. So, going back to the 1960s and 70s and the kind of birth of the internet, and then the spread of that, and the invention of the World Wide Web, the growth of that, the rise of social media. And I think, um, you know, there is a strong argument that could be made that this is kind of moving faster than ever before, because I think it combines lots of different elements of those previous revolutions into this one sort of cataclysmic moment, which is you have the kind of tech innovation that you had that allowed the birth of the internet. And AI has a long and storied history that goes far back beyond the last 6 months. Term was coined back,
Mm.
sort of 60, 70 odd years ago, and we often overlook that. 1956 was the birth of AI as a phrase at the famous Dartmouth summer conference, where the idea was first drawn up. But I think what we're seeing here is that kind of gold rush element of the early internet combined with the kind of big tech steps that we often thought of when you think of Moore's law, and that's kind of gone out the window because of the rise of pace of GPU development, along with these kind of huge societal impacts that maybe we've never really seen in the world of quote unquote tech by the sense of IT, but actually, we maybe have to look back to kind of the arrival of Henry Ford's production line to think about like how this impacts the humans and the rise of automation, because this seems like almost like a new industrial revolution, at least if the hype is to be believed.
Well, exactly. And we are constantly being told of technological revolutions being the one that's going to change society, whether it's the metaverse or whether it was NFTs or whether before that, um, the web itself. And certainly some of those have come to fruition and some of them perhaps not so much. What do you think it is about generative AI that gives it the potential over things like other previous hypes? Do you think there's something particular about this technology that makes it special?
I think it's the sheer power of it, and I think what's interesting about it is it's the sheer power of it at such an early stage, because there is an argument to be made, and it is often difficult to remember this. We are only just over 6 months into this,
Mm.
and we haven't really got to grips with how you use this stuff in the most powerful way. Like, it's very, very plausible that in 2, 3, 5 years' time, we'll look back at November 2022 to June 2023 as kind of the era of, prehistoric cavemen looking at like an axe and using it to try and, I don't know, brush their hair or something. Like, we have the tools, but we don't necessarily know that we're using it properly. Like, generative AI is being thrown into so many different aspects of our lives, to search engines where frankly doesn't seem like it works, to kind of chatbots where it could work but there's no guarantee that this is the best use case. We're kind of seeing text to image prompts in Midjourney and Stable Diffusion, where is a kind of text prompt where you have to kind of code your prompt in a very specific way to
Mm.
get the best possible outcome actually the best use. of this technology. And so that's, I think, what's quite so exciting about it is so transformative and so scary and kind of awe-inspiring, and yet we're like the baby who's just got the toy and is like trying desperately to put the square peg into the round hole, and we don't know if we've actually got the right method of using this yet. So if it's this powerful now, who knows what it's going to be like when we actually get to grips with this and we go, this is how this works, this is the best way to eke out every last inch of power that comes from this, and who knows where we'll be then.
Mm, precisely. Do you think it's also something to do not just with the power of the technology, but it's immediacy, and it's here right now, and it's in everybody's hands, and it's not a concept that's being talked about as a future tool or a future. It's right here. Like, people are using it. You can sign up and get an account tomorrow. And I don't think some of the previous hypes, I think, have felt a little bit more opaque as to how you actually get involved with it, whether it's crypto, NFT, metaverse. These are cool concepts, and they're talked a lot about at conferences. But I think that for the average person in the street, it might feel a little bit distant. However, this tool feels different because it is here, and it's a website, and you can access it, and you can talk to it without having to learn anything about. There's no manual to read. It's that kind of immediacy that suddenly has grabbed the public's attention. Have you felt that as well?
Yeah, I think there are a few people who don't have a smartphone or some sort of reliable internet access who haven't tried ChatGPT in particular. And it is interesting that, as with lots of things in technology, ChatGPT was kind of a success born out of failure, right? They released it publicly because they didn't really know what this thing would be best for, and they were looking to try and iron out the wrinkles. And so they said, well, let's get this to a broader audience of beta testers to see if they can kind of kick the tires and find the problems with it. And lo and behold, they create a phenomenon that's like 100 million people use it, and that's kind of remarkable. I mean, the analogies that folks make sometimes, and you see a lot of kind of uh, sort of analysts who go, well, this is growing faster than Netflix did, and this is growing faster than YouTube did. Those two things are very significantly different platforms, but there is this kind of ability of seeing is believing. And so even then, if you have 100 million people seeing it, they almost invariably become the best advocates for ChatGPT and generative AI writ large once they get their hands on it. Although there is this interesting element that we're starting to see, particularly in the last few weeks. I reported on it for the I newspaper, of the honeymoon period kind of disappearing as power users start to think, well, is the GPT technology more generally actually as good as it claims to be, and actually as good as I thought it was? Because some people think their performance has become worse, and
Mm.
there's lots of sort of odd conspiracy theories behind that, of they're deliberately making it worse because it's not right, or people are kind of bombing the human feedback element of it with
Mm.
attempts to try and draw it off course, or probably more realistically, the idea that they're just running out of compute and therefore they have to kind of throttle it because everybody is running out of compute now, because this is the new gold rush.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Precisely. I think I'm always surprised, actually. Really surprised, actually, at the number of people I know who I show this technology to. Not people who are in generative AI, but just general my friends and so on, who are sort of pleasantly surprised by it, but not amazed. And when I saw it for the first time, I was blown away. I was really quite shocked. It was quite a sort of, I felt like this is a moment I'll remember, the first time I used Chat GPT, and I'm always amazed, actually, the number of people that sort of see it as a nice sort of trick, but but it's not for me. It's not really. It's something that I might use to kind of do a few party games, but actually it's not going to help me in my life. Have you found that as well, or have you found the opposite, that people are generally amazed by it? And I'm talking about just everyday people who are going about their everyday lives.
Yeah, no, I think for that group of people, the majority of them see it as an interesting parlor trick, and they kind of
Mm.
they use it, they're impressed by it, they go, that's really cool, and then they kind of forget about it. And that's in
Yeah.
large part because the challenge of prompting it right, of getting the kind of successes out of it that you really want, can be quite difficult. Of that user base, you'll then have, a small percentage of power users who go, right, this is truly transformational. I want to learn how to kind of eke out every last benefit of this.
Mm.
They learn how to prompt it best. And you know, none of us have escaped the Twitter tech bros who are shilling their kind of best GPT prompts for 99.99
Mm.
subscription or whatever it is like. And so there are those people who use it. For me personally, I kind of almost fall into the former more than I do the latter, in the sense of a lot of what I do doesn't translate hugely well to kind of the generative AI
Mm.
framework. I deal in absolutes, I deal in facts, I deal
Mm.
in creativity, but making sure that it has that kind of rigorous non-fiction basis. And so, um, you know, I have tried over the course of researching books and things to get ChatGPT to do a little bit of kind of synthesis of
Mm.
information for me, but there's always this question of, is everything in there actually factual, or am I going to look really stupid if I put in a hallucination that actually, this person didn't invent this technology, even though ChatGPT says it did? And do I really want to like have egg on my face in that way? And so I see the strengths, I see the potential for it, but also I think, um, for my particular use case, the facts are everything, and therefore it becomes too much of a high risk act to kind of rely on it alone. And actually, the way that I work is it's often just as quick for me to find that information out myself than to get ChatGPT to do it and then fact check it.
Mm. And it comes to this point, doesn't it, of how a technology like this should be used by everybody. The student in the classroom, the journalist writing an article, the business person looking to write a pitch. So I'd be curious to dig into a little bit more about how you do
Mm.
use it. You've said that you've used it a little bit, but it's actually not that useful. Is there anything where you found it really has made a difference to either your professional work or just your everyday life?
Um, so I've been using uh, ChatGPT Plus, which is the $20 a month paid
Yeah.
version, which gets you access to GPT-4, which is the slightly more up to date version of the underlying language model behind ChatGPT, and also gives you access, and more crucially for me, gives you access to the option to add plugins on to
Mm.
ChatGPT. So one of the kind of use cases that I found for it is, there are plugins that are really useful that allow you to basically feed in a YouTube URL. It will feed that URL through a plugin that then gets ChatGPT to analyze the contents of the video
Nice.
based on the transcript, and then gives you kind of like a bullet point of view. So, for instance, Sam Altman was on the Lex Friedman podcast a couple of months ago. It's like an hour and a half long. Truthfully, like, I don't want to listen. Like,
Mhm.
with the best one in the world, David, and I know I'm part of the problem here. There's too many podcasts out there with too many white men talking to each other in microphones. And Sam Altman's great, Lex Friedman's interesting, but like, I don't have the time or inclination to listen to that. And
Cool.
so, put it through ChatGPT with that plugin, it will give you the kind of TLDR summary, and
Mhm.
then you can interrogate that summary. So it kind of gets over the hallucination problem in that I can say, right, well, you said Altman said this. Can you give me the quote in the video where he said that? And then you can, it doesn't work perfectly because it doesn't give you the timestamp, but it can give you a rough area of where the quote came from. And so you can then double check that way quicker. So rather than having to scrub through a 90-minute video, I can do this, set it running, takes 5 minutes or so, and is kind of better than me listening to it for that.
Yeah, great. So you almost use it more for information summarization than information expansion. I guess
Yeah.
as a journalist, that's the antithesis of what you're about. You're about fact, as you say, and reality rather than hallucinatory expansion of a small amount of information. And I think that will be really interesting how that translates into the classroom and schools within education, particularly a particular area that I'm really fascinated to see how developed it is, how it develops is how this technology is used within the classroom, because I think there's a real danger of particularly perhaps journalism students or anyone actually who's in humanities or looking to generate ideas as a result of things that they've read, to not only use ChatGPT to summarize sources and summarize information and gather and synthesize quickly, but also to use it to churn out the essay or churn out the report. And people who aren't as scrupulous as yourself will be using this not just as a way to improve their processes, but actually to try and cut corners with their
Mm.
writing. So, do you fear your profession is under threat, or do you think actually that the best journalists will shine through as those who know how to use the technology correctly?
Yeah, I feel lucky because journalism is a very difficult thing for AI to do, because it requires you to go out and talk to people, which AI can't do. And um, you know,
Yes, or ever.
yeah, precisely, and that's kind of the thing. Like, I feel relatively insulated from the risks of this revolution as a journalist because I've kind of seen it in action. In that, like, without kind of identifying individuals, I'm pretty sure that one of my students tried to use ChatGPT to create a series of journalism stories that they were required to do for assessment, and it was very, very easy to find them out because the stories were focused on a very small geographical area. I happen to know that geographical area very well. There's maybe 10,000 people in it in total, and I know all of the key decision makers and the people who they would have spoken to. And the story that they produced um, invented local schools, invented local school head teachers, invented a local university, invented a local business, and
Mm.
the owner of that local business. And when it comes to those kind of verifiable facts, it's very, very easy to find the fault in it. So that's why I kind of feel journalism is safe. Now there are bits that it could do relatively easily in the sense of you could feed it um, information about the classic example that we always use in journalism that's been the case when this was called robo-journalism five,
Mm.
10 years ago was sports reports, right? Like this basketball team beat this basketball team 89-62. This person scored 5 3-pointers. They were the most valuable player in the game. Write the report, and it can do that okay. But as soon as you are required to kind of go out of those very prescriptive boundaries, I think that it really starts to fall down. But of course, if you're talking about kind of like more general report writing in research for businesses, doing internal reports, doing kind of think tanky style stuff, I think it's possible to kind of get the boilerplate stuff there.
Mm.
But the fundamental thing is the generated text is never particularly good.
Yeah, I wonder though that the use of these tools to generate articles, or at least to get off the blank page syndrome, is something that is powerful. And I wonder if I mean, the example that you gave there of your student is it's, I would say, pretty lazy to then just say, well, it's generated me an article, I'm not even going to bother go back and check
Yeah.
it. And that for me, that speaks to a sort of a deeper lack of wanting to put effort into a piece of work. And I'm sure whether that student would have ChatGPT or not, the same sort of ideas would be true of that person's piece of work, because it's just showing a lack of rigor in report writing. Um, so I wonder though if there is a use case for it, which is to say, look, I want to get off the blank page, and I want to get a boilerplate, like you say, something in place that I can then fill out the details, put my own slant on it, and that I can imagine this being extraordinarily powerful for people who perhaps want to get into journalism, but they find, dyslexia is a common problem
Mm.
amongst children, and that to be able to say, look, you've got a starting point now that gives you something to work with, that's quite powerful, I think. And do you
Yeah.
think it will start to creep into journalism in that way, so that you maintain the authenticity of what you're writing? You can genuinely say it's your work at the end of it, even if it's enhanced by AI.
I think possibly because I've spoken to people who have used it for that, not in journalism, but in kind of um, that. I spoke to someone who works for a Big Four consultancy who uses it to kind of develop a framework for their thinking, and then they fill it in, and they had. A lot of people who I speak to have ADHD. I've basically written a draft of a story that hasn't yet been published about how people with ADHD are using ChatGPT to get over exactly that issue. The kind of, I can't sit down and concentrate long enough,
Yeah.
bluntly, to fill a page.
Mm.
And so it gives you that kind of skeleton argument that you can then flesh out and adapt. And I think that's a smart way of using it. For me personally, that's not a speedier way of using it, although I admit that I'm quite unusual in that a lot of my work, I'm very lucky in that I managed to write relatively fluently innately without having to think about it, and
Mm.
get a kind of passable structure for my stories without having to kind of sit down with pen and paper and go, this bit will go here, this bit will go here. I just write and it happens.
Mhm.
But for people who struggle with that sort of stuff, I can see this being quite a powerful tool for them.
What I'm interested to ask you is how you think you developed that skill in the first place. Because obviously, we've grown up in a world without these tools. So we've actually had to go through the pain of understanding how to write fluently. And that means that there is content out on the web that contains fluent writing from people like yourself who have effectively poured time and effort into learning the skill. And ChatGPT is taking that and learning from it to be able to give it to people who haven't spent the time to do that.
Mm.
So do you worry about, and just to go back to this point of sort of laziness ultimately, do you think we'll become lazier as a society as a result of these tools? And is that a danger?
I think that there is a concern that we will outsource our thinking, yeah.
Mm.
In that, like, I mean, you kind of already see this, right? I mean, the main kind of point of discussion at the minute around the use of ChatGPT is the deployment of it in a couple of court cases where, lawyers representing individuals asked ChatGPT to help them develop the brief to go into court and sent to a judge about their case in particular, and it just hallucinated legal cases, and they kind of they were, with the best will in the world, a little bit lazy and a little bit too trusting of the technology, and they never thought that it would be possible for this to kind of fictionalize elements. And so I think there is already that risk because of the way that it's being presented
Mm.
by the companies behind it and by the media who have bought into this kind of narrative of this is the future of work. This is this kind of infallible tool that is trained on all of our lives. And because of the fact that it's also been put into use cases in its early days, like search, where really when we enter a search term into a search engine, we're asking for a verifiable,
Mhm.
factual, unimpeachable answer to it,
Mhm.
which AI can't provide. And that's kind of, I think, what's really interesting about it is I don't think it's necessarily like I don't think everybody's going, oh, great, generative AI has arrived. I don't have to think anymore. I think it's, oh, generative AI has arrived. We've been told that this is this superhuman worker and robot that will do all of our thinking for us. So
Mhm.
why don't I just let it do all of our thinking for me? And it's not actually able to do that, I don't
Yeah.
think.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's sort of being sold, not missold, but misinterpreted as to what it can do and what it can't do. And you get that little bit at the bottom of ChatGPT, which says that it might hallucinate and might make up facts, but it's certainly not very visible for somebody just using the tool for the first time. And I think, exactly like you say, people have become so accustomed to typing into something into Google and expecting verifiable results that have come through, a lot of time and effort being put into building a search indexer that effectively know that you're going to get at least human generated content back that somebody has written themselves. And now this is a different paradigm. It's nothing of the sort. And I think a lot of people think that it is just searching the web.
Mm.
And it's only now, obviously, with things like the Bing integration that we're starting to see that. But even then, it can still hallucinate. I think, again, it's a misconception that, just because it's now connected to Bing, all that means that it's going to do is scrape a few pages, pull the results back, and then off it goes. And it's more than we're happy to hallucinate whatever it wants after that point. Um, so yes, I think how the public is educated as to how the tool is used is critical. Um, I wonder then, just to kind of stick on that point a little longer, um, do you think that we hear a lot about misinformation, and particularly with journalism, that it's constantly a battle between people who are trying to genuinely tell the truth and people who are trying to deceive and misinform and misinterpret facts to suit their argument. Um, do you think that the tools such as ChatGPT and any large language model will contribute to that tidal wave of misinformation and misdirection? And if so, how does the industry of journalism fight back against that?
Oh, hugely. I mean, yeah, like it already is. And there's disinformation, and deliberate use of this, and then misinformation, a kind of accidental creation of fabrication and the sharing of it. And then there's also this kind of awkward middle ground in between. So, I mean, yeah, it is already happening. And a large part of my coverage of AI lately has been debunking some of those, or at least getting to the truth and adding more context to the stuff that we encounter. So, um, I interviewed a Chicago laborer called Pablo Xavier, who is in his mid 30s and was messing about with Midjourney and created images that spread around the internet of the Pope wearing a Balenciaga puffer jacket. And those were deliberately created for fun and designed to be presented as, I've done this with AI, but then they were shorn of that context and spread throughout, and also added to pre-existing images of the Pope against, one of which was him stood next to a really fancy car, which was a legitimate image and a genuine image of him. For like it was every year he blesses an Alfa Romeo or something like that, I think, which is completely bizarre and very, very Catholic. But anyway, they presented the image of that alongside the image of him in a Balenciaga puffer jacket as here's this Pope that is out of touch with reality and is spending profligately, and that's not true. Likewise, a week before that, and this is kind of the interesting thing, this period of time, I think it was, I don't remember when, because frankly, time's been moving so fast and collapsing in on itself. I think it was March or April or something like that. There was a week-long period where you had it was bookended. The end of it was the Balenciaga Pope, and the start of the week was Elliot Higgins, who was the founder of Bellingcat, a website whose job is to debunk disinformation, who decided to tinker around with Midjourney and create images of Donald Trump being arrested, because we'd been told that he was going to be arrested any minute now, and it was kind of an interesting thought experiment to see what Midjourney could do on that. I think it might have actually been Dali, I can't remember which. But what was interesting is those also spread and kind of became taken out of their context when Elliot designed them to be, look how weird this satire is, and they became kind of honestly taken images. So there is this kind of huge concern around this, and in the last week we've seen Futurism, which is a really interesting news website, did a story in the last couple of days about a kind of fictionalized news website that has created fake stories using ChatGPT, quoting experts who never spoke to them. And so you can start to see this. And I think it's difficult to know how to tackle that other than the same toolbox that we've been using as journalists against disinformation for years, which is that when you come across a falsehood or you come across something that isn't genuine, you notice it, you share it, but you share it in a way that makes it clear and sort of irremovable that this is fake. So we used to, on deep fakes or faked images, we used to put big crosses over them and say this is fake and explain why. Like that's, I suppose, what you have to do, but it's very, very difficult nowadays, particularly because our media literacy still lags behind everything like technology to actually figure out a route to assure people of what is real and what isn't.
Do you worry though that we live in such a time that it almost doesn't matter whether something is real or not for people to buy into it? And there is a danger, I think, of misinformation being used not almost as a let's try and make this as real as possible and actually genuinely fool people, but the bar is incredibly low, I think, for putting content out there that is extraordinarily sketchily put together with made up facts and a poor synthesis of information anyway, and it convincing a large proportion of the population that something is indeed true. So I wonder, is there a real danger of almost fighting back against this is almost futile, because even if you manage to debunk that article and spend time and effort, and it takes time to fact check
Mm.
sources, and you don't want to be making erroneous judgments about somebody's journalism when actually they did spend time into finding that person to speak to. Do you think it's almost, there is a bit of, it feels a little bit futile to fight back against because of the quantity of it, but also does it make a difference if you debunk it? Does people do that almost doesn't matter as much as the initial proliferation of the content, and it's the cat's out the bag by that point.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that we live in a post-Trump world and a post-Cambridge Analytica world, and we're kind of, it would be remiss to not point the finger at kind of the previous generation of technology revolution that we had, which was the social media one, where we kind of let these companies run wild and self-police, and then we realize that actually they're rubbish at
Mm,
self-policing, which is why, in large part, I think we have this kind of huge drive right now within the first 6 months of generative AI by politicians worldwide to say, quick, let's put fences around this in the best way that we can with the tools that we have right now. Um, so, we're always going to have those people who will believe what they believe because there is this emotional connection, this emotional response to fake news. And we know from prior academic research, I wrote stories on this back in kind of 2017 when the early academic research was coming out, that, people share fake news more if it kind of hits them emotionally
mm,
and they sort of agree with the principles behind it. They kind of, short circuits their rational thinking in their brain to do this, and that becomes much more alarming when you're thinking about the ability to generate deep faked images. But what we used to call deep faked images, but we now call generative AI
mhm,
images. Um, but I do think that there is still a value in trying to debunk it, because I think you'll always have those kind of fringes on either side who will believe whatever they believe, even if you present them with the reality.
mm,
But there's still the middle ground where people can kind of, different degrees of people can potentially run the risk of slipping into those fringes of I'll believe whatever I want, regardless of the reality. And if we don't keep debunking, then that middle ground gets smaller and smaller and cedes ground to the fringes.
mm. I know Elon Musk has talked previously about building his own version of GPT, which he's called
Mm.
Truth GPT, and the idea where it's kind of optimized to truth. Um, I think it's a very sketchy idea, obviously at the moment. But I wonder your thoughts about whether we can align these models to truth and what that even means. Whose truth? Is there something that you, or have you sort of seen on the ground a movement towards this, or do you think actually we should let large language models be themselves, and there needs to be wrappers around the content and ways of understanding how to interpret the information, and sort of public education that needs to go into the dangers of these tools, rather than trying to make the tools themselves more aligned to some sort of version of the truth, because you end up just with either a dystopian future where it's the wrong truth that you've aligned to, or that it's just simply not possible.
Yeah, I think it's probably the latter, isn't it? In that we just need to educate people about the biases that are built into these things, and the media literacy that is required to check these things after the fact. Because not to do down Elon Musk, but I imagine that there is a significant proportion of the world's population who would not ascribe to his version of the truth, particularly in the last few weeks and months, as he's sort of dallied with people on Twitter who most right-thinking people, I imagine, would be slightly squeamish about. And so, his idea of the truth is difficult, and it comes down to, you can never fully have objective truth. It's impossible. Everybody will always bring their own biases to it, including journalists. And we try as much as we can to eliminate those things when we cover stories, but it is impossible to do so because my lived experience will be different to my colleagues' lived experience who grew up in a single parent household, whose experience will be different to a colleague who grew up astronomically rich, to a colleague who grew up as a third world kid to a colleague who grew up in the global south rather than the global north. Each of those things brings its own kind of shifting sands into what we think of as the truth. And so it's kind of impossible to do. If Elon Musk wants to spend his money on Truth GPT, then fine. But maybe it's the $1 billion that he had earmarked for OpenAI when he helped set it up back in 2015, and then pulled out in 2018 because he didn't like the direction of travel that the company was going in.
Quite possibly. And what are your thoughts on labeling of AI content? This is something that's being talked about quite strongly at the moment, certainly within the UK, and that the regulation that we're looking to bring in and start discussing independently, I guess, of the EU regulation that has just been released. The idea that, as consumers of this stuff, we might want to know what's in it in the same way that we want to know what's in our food. So what do you think about the idea that if something is put out online without any human eyes against it, that it should be labeled as such? Do you think that's a good idea?
Yeah, I think it is, because it allows you to recognize some of the issues that may come from that. And I think going into more detail than that in terms of, there are kind of different degrees of what is useful and what's important. So the UK's AI rules, and they're super early days, and a lot of them are kind of like being recommended by think tanks and aren't really yet official government policy. But the idea of, for instance, putting a requirement on generative AI platforms to explain what copyrighted material is used in the training of their models is good, because that enshrines the copyright of the creators of that stuff. In terms of whether you're going to, as an end consumer, be able to pass the output of your large language model because it was trained 12% on the Bible, 8% on the collected works of Harry Potter, 4% on the Lord of the Rings, and 2% on Stephen King novels. I'm not as convinced that we have the kind of, the average person has the understanding of what impact that would have on their outputs. So I think that's not as important, but it works as a signal to say, hey, look, this wasn't created by a human. We know this technology is still kind of janky at the minute and not fully perfectly formed. So you might want to treat this output with a little bit more skepticism than maybe your average human.
Mm. And would it bother you if the large language models were ingesting, and as I'm sure they are, ingested a lot of your written articles that you've put out there over the years, and perhaps there's a future prompt where you can write in the style of Chris Stokel-Walker? Would that bother you as a journalist?
It's too late, isn't it? I mean, it's interesting. The Financial Times was reporting over the weekend, which is mid-June, that Google and OpenAI have entered into and Facebook, I think, as well, have entered into informal discussions with news publishers, including News UK and others, the publisher of the Times and the Sunday Times, over payments for rights for training their models, which is kind of an interesting one. It's kind of like stealing huge volumes of gold from your vault and then coming back a couple of years later and saying, oh, we took all the gold here. Let's negotiate a price for the gold that we took. I can go into ChatGPT now and I can say, you are Chris Stokel-Walker, a technology journalist and author.
Mm.
Please write something in my style. And it's not great, but it's not terrible either. Because that's literally the bread and butter, right, of this thing. My work will have been sucked up in the captures of the internet, the captures of the web that are used to train, in particular, GPT 3.5, GPT 4, the tools behind ChatGPT, and so they will have a passable knowledge of how I write, and the whole basis behind large language models is that they're playing a big word guessing game. They're looking at the previous words in a sentence and saying, well, what's likely to come next? And I use a lot of dashes in my writing, so they will know from looking at a simple statistical analysis of my writing that after a certain number of words, you're likely to put a dash in there. And so, yeah, like it's too late. I think it's concerning that it's too late, but also I'm a kind of jaded tech skeptic, tech reporter, where I kind of assume already that all of my information has been
Mm.
mined and used and monetized for whatever way they want, and there's very little that I can do about it now except complain on podcasts, basically.
That's, yeah, that's certainly true. Would you say you're optimistic about the future then, or pessimistic? Because I get the impression that you speak about the technology very positively sometimes and say it's remarkable, but also I do get a sense that there's a fear of what might happen. Where would you say you stand on the spectrum of true optimism that this is going to do no harm to AI doomer, and we're not going to be here in 2 years to talk about it?
It depends on what side of the bed I get up from in the morning, David. Look, AI doomerism, not going to happen. I think, and it is notable that I did a story for Popular Mechanics where I talked to a lot of the people who are fully signed up to the singularity theory. So the singularity theory, for our listeners who maybe don't know, and there will be lots of them who do know already, but forgive me for explaining it for those that don't. It's this idea that AI will become sentient. We will move from AI, artificial intelligence, to AGI. The one-letter word difference is hugely significant because it adds the word general in there. Artificial general intelligence is essentially this idea that AI can think for itself, act for itself, do all this stuff. And from there, if you ascribe to science fiction, then you get into the world of robots starting to enslave humans and make them do what they don't want to do. And by them, I mean us. Um, it is notable that these boys have been crying wolf, and also, by the way, they are often boys. These boys have been crying wolf for 20 odd years, and saying the the AIs enslaving us are coming tomorrow. The AIs enslaving us are coming tomorrow, and they never have. We are obviously seeing a huge step in technological advances that kind of makes it more likely, but I just don't see it. And it's interesting that of the three quote unquote godfathers of AI, and again, this comes with a kind of huge caveat of the media has managed almost singularly to wipe out any female contribution to the development of AI. It's weird that we have three godfathers, but we don't have three godmothers or anything like that. But the three godfathers of AI, Geoffrey Hinton, Jan LeCun, and Joshua Bengio, two of whom used to work for big tech companies. Geoffrey Hinton quit Google, as everybody has probably seen in the last few months. Jan LeCun works for Facebook alongside working at a university in the US part of the time. Two of those three, Hinton and Joshua Bengio, believe that we have a risk of extinction. Jan LeCun came out in mid-June, basically said, these two people are, I don't know what they're talking about. They're crackers. Of course it's not going to happen. I'm more on the LeCun side than I am Hinton and Bengio, just because I don't see how this works. We have a plug, right? All this stuff is plugged in. My laptop, if I leave it on, I do. I never turn my laptop off. I put it on standby. I just shut the lid. When I shut it at night and I come back the next morning, it's at 4%. Sometimes if I haven't been plugging it in until late on in the evening, it doesn't turn on again. Like, we can always pull the plug here. There are impacts that it will have in terms of work and society and things like that. But this idea that it's going to be kind of a super intelligence that's going to overtake us, don't think so.
Mm. Well, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm certainly on your side of the fence with this argument as well. I'm debating in a few weeks' time someone who's on the other side of the fence, and I've been racking my brains to try to steelman their argument so that I can try to defend my own point of view against it. So let me put a few of the kind of steelman arguments across of the
Mm.
other side. I think they would say, well, look, even if AGI isn't able to be embodied and walk around with its own methods for causing havoc, perhaps it could do so in a more indirect way in that it can influence humans to do so. So either through things like misinformation or having an overall objective function that is in some way nefarious, and that it can find its own way to prioritize tasks and split those tasks up into multiple copies of itself on multiple servers, and that suddenly we find that we've lost control, not because we can pull the plug on one of those servers, but because it's suddenly spread around not only other servers, but also the minds of other human beings. And it's much harder to stop that kind of virality once it's in society as a concept. Now, again, this is not my
Yeah.
argument. This is the argument of the other side. So I can't sort of speak of the detail of this, because that's my point, is that I don't think the detail stands up to scrutiny. But I wonder if you could sort of just speak briefly about this idea that it may not be AGI itself that ends up causing us havoc, but its ability to influence the opinions of other humans.
Yeah, so this argument kind of stems back 20 or so years. There was a very, very famous experiment called the AI in a box experiment, which was done by a guy called Eliezer Yudkowsky, who is kind of one of the big thinkers of the rationalist side, which believes that AI is going to kind of overtake us eventually. And Yudkowsky basically challenged a bunch of researchers to play a game where he would play the role of an artificial intelligence agent and would try and convince them to let him out of the box and wreak havoc essentially on the world. It was a simulated game. There was not ever any sort of AI involved in it. But Yudkowsky did manage to win both of those. I actually spoke to, for this Popular Mechanics story, one of the two people who was engaged in the original game, who was convinced to let him go. And uh, it was interesting to hear him talk about that, because he never had. But I think that even if that were to happen with a small proportion of people, or frankly a large proportion of people, there would still be, out of those three godfathers of AI, at least one of them who could be there to pull all the switches. It's not a billions of people in this world. Like, you'd have to convince a majority of them, and probably a super majority of them, because if you're facing an extinction event, I think you probably do some pretty incredible things to try and not be extinct. So it's like, I don't know whether it's 100 people, a few good men and women, or many good men and women, or a million that you need. But I find it difficult to believe that you could engage in some sort of mass delusion on a scale that would mean that you could never try and overcome AI.
Yeah, certainly. And I think it's interesting, isn't it, that the only difference actually from today to, say, even a year ago, or the times when other AI existential risks were being talked about, is that we have a model that can model human language remarkably well. And I think it's an incredible concept that one idea has led to this hysteria over AGI taking over the world and causing so much havoc. And I think if we look back and we realize what we've built, do you find it interesting that language has played such a large part in this? I mean, your background is in language and in training your brain to write it in such an eloquent way. Do you find it amazing that seemingly we always used to think, didn't we, that language and the command of language is something that is born out of intelligence, but it seems almost that we've reversed that causality, and that the language itself, if we can train a machine to master it, that somehow intelligence emerges out of it. Do you think that's quite a powerful concept? Have you sort of thought about it theoretically like that, or?
Yeah, I think it's one that has. I think you're right. The reason why we are so why these kind of existential threat folks have become so het up right now is because it is language that we're using rather than anything else, and it's notable that that's kind of been the goal throughout the history of the development of AI. I'm not hugely secretly writing a book on AI. I've been tweeting word count updates for the last couple of months, and so it's not like it's a state secret or anything. But I've been looking at kind of AI and the history of it, and in the, I think it's the early '60s, there was a kind of experiment by IBM and I think Georgetown University in the US, where they basically did an early version of machine translation, where they um, could input Russian language inputs and get it to translate it into English language inputs. Output, sorry, and they had a relatively rudimentary lexicon of words at the time, but they had this successful experiment that the New York Times and others covered, and then they came out with the fighting talk, which was, we're going to move from this 1,000 words or 100 words or whatever it was to way more, and then we're going to move on to French, and we're going to move on to German, and we're going to move on to Spanish, and in 5 years' time, this will happen, and everybody will be using this.
Hmm.
The history of AI is littered with, we've done this, we've had this amazing breakthrough, in 5 years' time we will. And I think that it's always been because we fall into that trap of language where we think this is the kind of innately human thing that makes us so powerful. We equate language with thoughts, and so we become very thoughtful when we see a computer essentially being able to mimic our language. But actually, it's not that much far removed from autocorrect or autocomplete on our phones, which we've had for years. And so it's always worth having that context. It is a souped up version, I admit, but it's not huge intelligence in the way that we often think it is.
Yeah, I do think though that it does speak volumes about the role that language plays in our own ability to reason. And I think what surprised people is that things like reasoning can seemingly come out of just predicting the next word. And we always sort of imagine that we'd have this reasoning part of our brain that holds within it the ability to kind of synthesize thoughts and ideas, and then we have a language part of the brain that is able to communicate that back out to external listeners and hear what other listeners are telling us, and then we farm that off to the logic part of the brain again and get it back. And I think what a lot of this modeling is showing us is that actually the same engine, the same functionality can seemingly cater for both. Not perfectly, albeit we seem to have the ability to symbolically reason as humans ourselves, and we would never make any logical fallacies, even if we were asked the same question 100 times. We're always going to give the correct result because we're using symbolic logic to work something out and not a stochastic parrot in our heads. And so there are seemingly differences, but there is something quite mystical, I think, about this idea that a language model can exhibit so much emerging capability. Um, have you been surprised at the power of it, or are you still
Yeah,
in the camp of it's good, but it's not that good?
no, I mean, I'm in the camp that is it's good, but it's not that good in the sense of it's not exhibiting general intelligence. But I think it is interesting, and you mentioned those kind of emergent capabilities that we've seen. It is interesting how well the training generalizes to other elements of our lives and other things and other processes, and that I think is what is. I think maybe that's what separates the this current generative AI revolution from the previous kind of false dawns of AI.
Mm.
When I was a kid, Deep Blue beat Gary Kasparov. Like, that was a major moment. Um, when in the early stages of my journalism career, AlphaGo beat Lee Sedol, who was a South Korean Go champion.
Mhm.
Like, those were impressive, but they were single tasks
Mm.
almost. I think what has been surprising is the ability of the proficiency of language and how you learn that to then be used in lots of other ways. That is kind of interesting. And I don't know if that's necessarily a a thing that is kind of scary and like sentient, or more just a case of human arrogance in what we thought was kind of unique thinking and everything. Maybe we thought we were smarter than we were, in that actually we just use those same basic skills in lots of other areas, or we can kind of use those skills at an AI level in different areas to produce a kind of passable imitation
Mm-hmm.
of intelligence. And so maybe it's telling us more about ourselves than it is about the technology that we use in a kind of odd, perverse way.
Yeah, I think I do agree with you that it's a mirage of intelligence rather than the same
Mm.
intelligence that we seem to exhibit. I think we've seemed to have tapped into something quite a deep idea. I think, and it's interesting to see how far we can take it. The idea of next token prediction, um, an autoregressive model, something that simply looks at what's come before and tries to guess what comes next. That concept, I think, will be one that we iterate over many, many times over the years to come. And in fact, LeCun's work as well with the JEPA architectures that he's working on at Meta um, look at the idea as well of can we model existence not just using tokens and words, but video and
Mm.
using video and something a bit more alike what we are experiencing through our visual senses, but also auditory, to effectively tokenize and produce a more rich understanding of the world than simply a stream of words. It just so happens that we've got a ton of text data available to us through the web, so I think that's why these technologies have kicked off first. Um, but it does make me wonder. I mean, I watch my 9 month daughter growing up now, and I wonder how much of what's going in her head is similar to the likes of GPT when it was being trained. Is she really just trying to predict the next token or the next thing that goes through her visual percept? I don't know, but it certainly seems like something different's going on. She seems to have a mind of her own most of the time. I just want to finish off with a few questions to you,
Mm.
Chris. We always ask everybody on the AI canvas how they perceive the next 5 years. What do you think is going to happen? What do you think the big risks will be? Um, I've already asked you whether you're pessimistic and optimistic, but I wonder if you could just take me through what does the next 5 years look like in your eyes with the experience of AI?
Good question, because if you'd asked me this 6 months ago, well, 7 months ago now, I don't think I would have predicted this. Look, I mean, we. I think we're going to kind of continue to see these big tech platforms trying to compete on this space to develop the best LLM. Obviously, we know kind of OpenAI is better at the minute, it seems, than Bard, but you mentioned Meta coming along as well, which is kind of an unknown concept in terms of the mainstream acceptance of this. Facebook AI research, Fair now Meta AI research, which when I rebranded, I did ask them if that means that they're going to be called Mare, and they did say it wasn't. Um, um, they've been doing a lot of the hard running on the kind of the quote unquote academic side, without people really realizing it in the mainstream. So I think that they'll kind of wade their way in. We can't overlook the fact that a lot of stuff is being done in open source at the minute, and I think that will be really interesting to see. It seems like we're going to get more specialized LLMs designed for like different tasks, which will hopefully be better than the general ones. We're going to kind of move from that kind of general knowledge, like being very good at pub quizzes, to being like a brain surgeon. There is quite a
Yeah,
difference in those two things. Um, I mean, crikey. I mean, I've done a story recently for Inverse, which will be published shortly, asking when we'll see the first Hollywood blockbuster completely made by AI. The timeline on that seems to be 3 to 5 years, if those experts are to be believed. So I can, let me say, possibly in 5 years we'll be watching the Transformers, literally Transformers GPT, Transformers :GPT. We'll call it that, which will probably be better than the Transformers movies anyway, because let's be honest, they're pretty identical stuff. So those two things I think will happen. If we're to believe Goldman Sachs, then and frankly some of the companies behind a lot of the AI developments, and we're going to see a lot of people retooling their jobs and their workflows to kind of accommodate this. We already see it with the rise of prompt engineers, and I think that'll be really interesting to see. Although, as with all of these things, I think that we kind of predict everybody will be out of a job, and then it's always the case that actually very few people are out of a job, and just a lot of people are doing their jobs slightly differently to how they did before. So I can imagine we'll become better at, we'll get taught how to engineer prompts better, in
Mm.
5 years' time than we do at the minute. But I think it's just going to be interesting to see how this all shakes out, because it's in such flux at the minute that it's very difficult to make kind of definitive predictions.
Yeah, for sure. And this is a bit off topic, but I'm going to ask you anyway. What were your thoughts on the Apple glasses? Have you obviously watched the promo video, and I don't know if you're doing any reporting around those. Do you
Yeah,
see
I
that?
did. I did a lot. I did a story for the BBC. I did a story for the iPaper. I did a story for the Times. I'm not going to be spending £3,500 on some ski goggles that make me look stupid and probably make me walk into a coffee table. What was really interesting was there's kind of, I guess, with Apple, you would be stupid to discount them.
Mm.
So it's very possible that this will become an actual thing. I think it will be helped by third-party peripherals at London Tech Week this last week, where I reported on for the Evening Standard. There was a startup that had developed they looked a little bit like roller skates meet treadmills, in that like they were individual on foot treadmills where you would walk forwards in AR or VR, but you actually wouldn't move in real life because the shoes would kind of drag you back, which would be good because it means that you won't clatter into things in this new world if we're going to have it. But again, I'm just so deeply skeptical that people want to live their lives in a metaverse, regardless of what we call it or who makes it. I just don't think it's going to happen.
Mm. Yeah, I always think to myself, it's interesting, isn't it, that so much has changed over the last 500 years of history. We're basically the same animals that we were, but a lot of our lives around us have changed. But some things are almost identical, but the way that we socially interact at a tavern is pretty much the same today as it was back then. We still talk about stories. We still go and eat and drink together, and technology hasn't really got in the way of that. And I do wonder sometimes with a lot of these products if they are trying to change too much about something very fundamental to who we are. Our interaction with other human beings is something that's so deeply personal. It would take a remarkable product, I think, to alter that in any meaningful way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do concur with that point. So yeah, lastly, perhaps my last question would just be around the regulation side of things. I mean, we've seen Sam Altman sort of publicly in the US kind of talk about his desire for them to be regulated, and that he feels like the industry needs it. What are your thoughts on that, and where do you think regulation will go? Because it's seemingly something that governments are all pretty aware of now, that they need to start at least making a public show that they're discussing this at the highest levels. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Weird that, isn't it? That incumbent who's got a $30 billion valuation suddenly sees the need to regulate in order to stop anything else happening that might threaten their incumbency. Class, tale as old as time. Um, Look, we do need regulation, and it is interesting that I think we're refracting all of this stuff through the lens of big tech, and kind of realizing that we don't want to go through the last 20 years again with AI, which is good. And that's fantastic, frankly, because God knows it was frustrating the last 20 years. And it is really good that we're starting to see some kind of global consensus. I think the UK's plans to be this kind of AI superpower, the kind of, I don't know, Captain Scarlet or Thunderbirds or whatever, the Tracy Island of.
Old enough to remember them. Yeah.
I used to watch them on repeat, so I'm not old enough to remember them. But I saw the second display of them in the early
Yeah, I think
'90s.
we're of the generation where our parents really loved them, and therefore we
Yeah,
had to like them too. They were.
exactly. Yeah, no, they were good. Look, I mean, the UK. It's good that they want to regulate AI. I think that they stand a chance of finding a middle ground between the US, which is just going to be, these are our companies, let them grow. What do you mean we have to regulate them? Which is what they did with social media, and the EU, which is like, we don't want any more US stuff coming in, so let's regulate the hell out of you. And it is interesting, actually, that two previously diametrically opposed bodies, the EU and the US, have come to that understanding of the code of practice that needs to be put in order to kind of bridge the gap while they're still developing the regulation. But the problem is, move fast and break things works fine if you are a tech company, even if you're a tech company working in such sort of widespread, ubiquitous technology as generative AI, which is a concern that you can just move fast, break things, and get away with it. Move fast and break things doesn't work when you're a government. And
Mm.
so it's always going to be, I think, the government chasing the tail of big tech companies. And you see this through the AI Act in the EU, which, we had media coverage in mid-June that said this has been passed, which is not correct. They agreed on a wording for a law in principle in the first stage of a multi-stage process that will see the law passed potentially by the end of the year, with an implementation date potentially of 2025 if everything works well and there is a fair wind and nobody falls out with each other in the future. And so, given 6 months ago this technology functionally didn't exist, what good is regulation drafted in
Yeah.
June 2023 going to be by January 2026?
Mm.
We're kind of in trouble, I think, here,
Yeah.
because AI is moving so quickly and regulation moves so slowly.
Yeah, the wheels of government don't turn that fast.
No,
So it would be fascinating to see the fallout from this, I think. Chris, it's been fantastic to talk to you. I could honestly talk to you for hours about this stuff, but we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Thank you again so much for joining us today on the AI Canvas. Pleasure speaking to you.
you too. Thank you so much.